Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Tom Ricks, and this series is about 11 things that we can do to make things better. I'm called the series Eagle is Phoenix because I have another blog besides Tossing Grenades at Windmills where I talk about political stuff, and some of these ideas will be taken from that. Some of these are totally new ideas that I've had based on what we've talked about so far. And specifically, I've also been requested to start a YouTube channel. They acknowledge my concerns about anonymity, but the truth is that I'm not really concerned about anonymity. Despite the fact that my 8 questions to be asked about the LDS Church being literally 10 times more viewed and successful than any other podcast I made about my own writing so far, I am not under the illusion that I'm going to become famous for this. The thing is that I know personally a lot of very intelligent and very well-read individuals who are much more likely to have an impact on the world than I am. So the reason I'm doing this podcast is to spark ideas, to spark debate, or in some cases to end debate. For example, recently on a friend's Facebook page, I had somebody who I have met and know and previously respected who still says, despite all evidence in the last 2 weeks to the contrary, that both sides are the same. You know, both sides do make mistakes. Both sides do sometimes serve their interests, but both sides don't vote for unindicted rapists. And that is the point at which we find ourselves with regards to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, it has often been said in these last couple of weeks and often before that, is the most vulnerable of the 3 branches of government because it has no troops and it has no purse from which to derive its power. It only has the desire and faith of the average citizen to respect the law and believe in the rule of law. Although technically that isn't true, Congress is given considerable powers to the federal judiciary to issue blocks or stays. Now, it is true that in the case of the Supreme Court, precedence is often totally ignored by lower courts, especially conservative justices. I'm going to discuss several ideas about things that need to happen, but I'll start with the fact that the Supreme Court had a lot of power, but its power did justifiably derive in large part from its legitimacy. I can argue that legitimacy, which has been carefully constructed and cultivated over the years, has occasionally been at risk. For example, Dred Scott was very controversial at the time, and in case you're not familiar with it, Dred Scott was a decision shortly before the Civil War in which it was found that slaves in free states could not sue for their freedom where slavery was illegal because people of African ancestry could not be citizens of the United States. Now, as outrageous and ridiculous as that is, technically speaking, the founding document said that African Americans are to be counted as 2/3 of a person, and this is going to horrify you, but I want to be clear. The 14th Amendment outlaws slavery. It doesn't technically explicitly strike this language from the Constitution. Now, I am in no way, shape, or form saying that African Americans should not get the vote or should be counted as 2/3 a person. What I'm saying is that this, to me, is all the more reason why we need to rewrite the entire document, because somebody like the justices of Dred Scott can use that arcane and disgusting language to justify their actions. And I do want to point out that Kavanaugh is exactly the kind of person who would have voted for Dred Scott. he takes pride in how much of a conservative and a, quote, original interpreter of the Constitution that he is. The Supreme Court in the last century has done a lot of good and a lot of bad. Brown versus the Board of Education set the template to end apartheid / Jim Crow. The recent decisions which ended several prejudicial cases, such as Obergefell versus Hodges, ending the prejudice against gay marriage, were something that accelerated societal reform much faster than the legislature would have done it. On the other hand, things like Citizens United, which pretends that corporations are people and was voted on by the so-called originalists, who say, on the one hand, XYZ, like Social Security, can't exist because there's nothing in the Constitution that says it, even though you point to, like, the General Welfare Clause. Whereas, you could make a corporation a person, and then they turn to the 10th Amendment, where they say, well, it doesn't say in the Constitution you can't do it, so therefore you can. The fact is that it's time to admit that these people are total hypocrites. They have no logic to their arguments. They have no values. They have no virtues whatsoever. And nothing in all of the last several years, decades even, where these people have been becoming more and more radical, nothing, in my opinion, says this more than 50 votes for an unindicted rapist, to be elected to the highest court in the land. We've had all these articles come out recently talking about how we have actually had a lot of very radical justices in the past, and including some of the ones that made the decision for Dred Scott. Clarence Thomas, in particular, was a sexual harasser, and actually Anita Hill's very brave statement actually caused a lot more awareness of sexual harassment, and suddenly corporations and organizations started having sexual harassment policies. It took a while for Me Too to follow after that, but we are slowly as a society making progress, except, of course, in red states, and if you're a conservative. And in those cases, they feel that the progress of civilization doesn't really apply to them. And to a certain degree, it doesn't. Specifically, laws, ethics, and morals are, at the end of the day, only as useful as they can be enforced. If you have a law on the books, but no one ever enforces that law, what good is it? In the Constitution, we have something called the Annulments Clause, which basically says that the president is not to receive gifts from foreign states without the permission of the Senate that can basically bribe him. And technically that extends to everybody in Congress as well, but Congress has made so many exemptions for itself that it's not even funny. It's illegal to meet a congressman or even the president in a back alley somewhere with $1,000 in a briefcase and cash and hand it to them and say, pass this law and I'll give you this money. But, giving them, China suddenly remarkably favoring Trump's vast business empire in a patent dispute, and suddenly Trump changes his mind on something, that's technically legal, especially since the courts have this really stupid thing called standing, which is the federal courts, that is, which basically says that if you don't have a justification, like if you're not a specifically injured party, or you're not like a state, somebody who by default of your very existence has the ability to take something to a federal court, then you can't. You know, the Supreme Court of India recently has been making a lot of remarkable decisions, kind of the opposite of our current court. And, they recently found that a temple, for example, that had prevented women of childbearing age from coming into the temple because they're dirty, their God doesn't like them, can't do that crap anymore. And the thing is in India that anyone of any age can make a petition to the court. Now, they do admittedly have to work harder. They have a backlog of supposedly 33 million cases, but this crap about standing does not exist because the court belongs to the people in India, not the elite bullshit that is our federal government. Let's remember something about the United States Constitution, folks. It was written by rich white landowners, and in the case of about half of them, rich white slave-owning landowners who felt that black women were their property and that they could rape them or have sex with their sex bots, 18th century style, anytime they wanted because they were property. I think that the time has come to rewrite the Constitution, but I'm actually not going to be focusing this podcast on rewriting the Constitution as much as I think we need to do it, or what I think that Constitution should look like. My solutions are going to be much simpler. I'm going to focus on things that we can do with the current crap Constitution that we have. And let's start with the composition of the Supreme Court. The phrase, "a stitch in time saves nine," is much older than the United States, and it basically originated with the idea that if you stitch your breeches now, you'll save yourself from having to make 9 later. But in the last century or so, it has basically commonly referred to the fact that FDR, in an effort to bypass the extremely conservative court, who was striking down everything that he was trying to do to save the country in the New Deal, basically wanted to expand the number of justices in the Supreme Court from 9 to 11. The thing is, and this cost him tremendously politically, and even though he didn't lose the next presidential election due to World War II, the Democrats lost several seats in the legislature the next time around. The thing is that historically speaking, this is a lot grayer of an area than people realize. Before 1869, the number of justices was not actually formally set to 9. It was between 7 and 9. And at the time when the Supreme Court was actually created, the number of justices wasn't actually known. So the number of justices associated with the Supreme Court is actually very vague. And if you read the actual Constitution itself, you will see that it is left entirely up to the legislature how the court will function and how many justices are in it. The only things that the Constitution sets about how the court is compromised is that it is the prerogative of the president to choose a nominee, and that with the advice and consent of the Senate, that the justice is basically added. So it doesn't even technically say how many people in the Senate have to vote to allow the justice to occur. Technically speaking, with the advice and consent of the Senate, you could make the argument that you could get away with a third of the Senate voting for it. Now, I admit that's a stretch, but my point is that, we can take something like the right to bear arms shall not be infringed with a well-regulated militia and totally ignore the well-regulated militia part and say that a private citizen has a right to a nuke. I've actually had an argument with a Second Amendment defender who has said that a private individual has the right to an atomic device in the Second Amendment. So if we're going to take that kind of a radical interpretation of the Constitution, saying that only a third of the Senate is required, is actually not that crazy. You're going to say things like, well, it doesn't matter what you say. This is my podcast, so I'm going to be very specific. We should no longer consider the court, as it is currently compromised, to be legitimate. That's the first and foremost thing that we should do. I'm going to start with the most obvious thing that anybody should do, which is to say that instead of saying the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, you should say the 8 justices of the Supreme Court and the unindicted rapist. Aside from the fact that Obama's nominee was held up due to Senate garbage and never even got a vote, and then we've elected this rapist to the Supreme Court. The guy also violated federal judicial standards for judicial conduct, which technically might not apply to the Supreme Court, although they should. But they definitely apply to standing judges, which he is. So he should have immediately lost his seat. But because of the fact that that's enforced by the House and the Senate, and Republicans have no values, of course nothing's going to happen. And the fact is that it's ludicrous to have the Justice Department, specifically the prosecution of laws, under the executive. It's ludicrous. And that's one of the things I'll be talking about in another podcast. So this time I'm just going to simply talk about what the easiest reform we can do to the Supreme Court is. And that is, Kavanaugh should be impeached immediately. Now, a lot of people don't realize what that means. The House impeaches and can do so with a simple majority. And that is clear. The process for that is actually set up in the Constitution. What most people don't realize is to actually do anything about it, the Senate has to vote for at a 2/3 majority. That's one of the very few specific measures for impeachment of any official in the Constitution. Most of the time it's left up to the Senate as to exactly, are they going to have this crap filibuster thing? Or is it going to be a majority? Whatever. But to actually remove somebody, strip them of their federal office, it does take 2/3. And technically speaking, it only applies that to the president or their own body. But the fact is that if it is reasonably expected that if it applies to the Senate, to expel somebody from the Senate or to expel the president, that you should apply it to cabinet members and other members of the judiciary. But technically speaking, you could theoretically, if they change the rules of the Senate, there's not a damn thing about it. I'm going to, just for purposes of argument, I'm going to sit here and read you the entire Article 3 of the Constitution, which talks about the Supreme Court. It's not going to take very long because it's really short. Article 3, Judicial Branch, Section 1. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges shall, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall, at stated times, receive for their services a compensation, which shall not be diminished during their continuance of office. Section 2. The judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made, or which shall be made under their authority, to all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, to the case of the admiral and maritime jurisdiction, to controversies to which the United States may be a party, to controversies between two or more states, between a state and citizens of another state, between citizens of different state, between citizens of the same state claiming lands under grants of different states, and between a state or citizens thereof and foreign states and citizens of subjects. In all cases affecting ambassadors or other public ministers and consuls, and those in which a state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have jurisdiction. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have the appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions as under regulations as Congress shall make. The trial of all crimes, except in the cases of impeachment, shall be by jury, and such trial shall be held in the state where the said crimes shall have been committed, but when not committed within a state, the trial shall be at such place or places as Congress may by law have directed. Section 3, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or adhering to their enemies, giving aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or in confession in open court. The Congress shall have the power to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work in corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of a person attained. Now, there's a lot of stuff in there, but there's a couple of things that I want to point out very clearly are not in there. The first one I want to point out is that there is not a damn thing that talks about impeachment. Not one damn thing. Except that it's not a trial by jury. So my point is that if you change the goddamn rules of the Senate, you could absolutely convict with just half of the Senate somebody who's not the president or somebody who is not the Senate. They talk about impeachment. It says here, the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office of impeachment or conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Here's the thing. Justices, in my opinion, the interpretation could be made that because one article is talking about it, another article is talking about it. And so I get that we talk about the fact that it basically, we're treating justices under one article versus another. But the thing is that we've already gone to such great lengths to twist the Constitution in different ways, which is to specifically say that, like, for example, there is no need for a well-regulated militia for you to have a gun, then why can't we simply say that justices are under a totally different standard than anybody under the executive branch, where it talks about impeachment, or where it talks about the Senate and House declaring their own rules about how they admit a member of their body. It says, the Constitution is explicit that says only the Senate has the power to determine whether or not somebody is actually elected to the Senate or not. It's explicit in that. It's not at all explicit in the judiciary. So if we truly wanted to, in 2020, if we have a Democratic vice president and we have 50 members of the Democrats, we could change the rules of the Senate to explicitly say that you can totally impeach and convict a judge if we so choose. Now, would that potentially cause civil war? Yeah, maybe. But you know what? If we have civil war, whoever fires the first shot is going to lose, because the FBI is really good at what it does and the military is really good at what it does. Either way, we should definitely impeach this bastard. He is already, simply because of his conduct in front of the committee of the United States, proved he is not fit to be a judge. He is not fit to be a justice of the United States Supreme Court simply because of his public display, his partisan display. This guy is supposed to be a referee between the left and the right, between the states and the federal government. This man is not fit to be a judge. And yet 50% of the Senate and 40% of the population of the United States thinks it's perfectly okay to have this basically unindicted rapist sit in judgment over me and you. Are you going to sit down and take that? Now, we talk about voting, and yeah, that's absolutely true. But the thing is that voting is like 101. Voting is like the absolute literal least you can do to fix this. Other things you can do to fix this are putting pressure on your political leaders to play hardball. In some of this I'm going to talk about in later podcasts, but the fact is that if you have somebody like Chuck Schumer in charge of the Democratic caucus in the Senate, then you're never going to get anywhere with changing the rules of the Senate to make it so that 50 is all you need to impeach a judge. The fact of the matter is that Chuck Schumer is on record within the last couple of weeks as saying, well, you know, we actually should, when the Democrats are in charge, be the adults in the room and change the filibuster, or reapply the filibuster to apply to Supreme Court justices. Excuse me? We're going to deliberately set the bar higher for us, which prevented us from getting one of Obama's nominees on the Supreme Court. And then as soon as you get a Republican Senate and a Republican president again, they're going to lower it back down to 50 so that they don't have to listen to us. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? We should put pressure on every progressive senator to not vote for Schumer. And on top of that, to basically be an open revolt and use the rules of the Senate that Chuck Schumer loves so much to prevent him from doing his job. We should not respect Chuck Schumer. We should not invite him to speak. When we have media events, we should basically say that, you know what, you have the centrist Democrats and you have the progressive Democrats. And people like Chuck Schumer don't speak for us. So when you have your panel of talking heads, you better have a progressive and you better have a centrist. Because otherwise you're not representing us, and you're trying to present multiple sides of a situation, and people like that don't speak for us. And if you're trying to work with these people, then you're part of the problem. You're part of the problem. These people don't even deserve a seat at the table, as far as I'm concerned. And definitely, we need to stop treating Republicans as equals. We need to stop talking to them as long as we're in a situation where they feel that the rules don't apply to them, that there are no rules, and that they're going to reward each other for doing this kind of thing. There is no legitimacy. Do not legitimize an unlegitimate Supreme Court. Now, I'm going to throw this out there, too, and then I'm going to end my podcast for this session. But the fact is that the Supreme Court has always been a political body. They try and pretend that they're neutral. They try and pretend that they follow the law, but they don't. They follow politics. And ever since the biggest of all the cases before the court, at least as far as the last century is concerned, the biggest one that affects the people on the right, that has made them justify every crazy and evil thing that they've ever done, is Roe versus Wade, where basically the Supreme Court said, you know what, a woman has a right to control her own body. And the people on the right are having none of that. None of that. So they have conspired to break the Senate, to suppress votes, to do whatever it takes to allow them and their elite billionaire buddies to lie, to cheat, to create an entirely independent, quote, media, end quote, apparatus in the case of Fox News, with no consequences and no legitimate answer from people on the left, because they empower these people by simply engaging with them. If you're a liberal and you appear on Fox News, you should be shunned by every other liberal in existence. So it's time we acknowledge that the Supreme Court is, in fact, an unelected third branch of the legislature. And that while there are certain things written in the Constitution about what they can and can't do, we can change the nature of the Supreme Court to the House of Lords. Now, there are other parts of the Constitution that say you can't do titles of nobility. Okay, that's fine. We still call them justices. But if we treated the Supreme Court like we do the House of Lords, where we take people who we feel are worthy of a lifetime appointment, like our great scientists, our great authors, our people who in Britain would be worthy of knighthood, and we appoint them to the Supreme Court, and we understand that it's a political office, then we can justify adding not just 9, but anybody that the president feels is worthy of sitting in judgment, of political judgment over our laws and other things like that. We should expand the Supreme Court to as many justices as we feel that there are people who are worthy of a potential title of nobility. Why not? If we just make the argument that we're going to simply expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court to, say, 11 because we got one stolen from us, that's not going to fly with the weak centrists. Because let's be honest, centrists are weak. They're disgusting. They think that both sides are the same. And to a certain degree, centrists are needed in times of peace to bridge the gap between the left and the right. But we're not in peace, and we haven't been at peace for a long time. The culture wars are the only wars that matter. The culture wars are what it means to be a human and to find our culture. So we haven't been at peace in our culture, if ever, certainly since Roe versus Wade. The time has come to stop making nice and to stop putting up with people who want to make nice. But you have to acknowledge the reality of what happened to FDR. FDR overreached, and it cost him politically. So if you make the argument that, well, they stole from our side, we need to retaliate, and I'm going to get into retaliation and how we should retaliate, and boy howdy, should we retaliate. But I'm going to get into an argument about that later. But the fact of the matter is that if we turn the Supreme Court into what it actually is and just acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is that the Supreme Court is political and always has been political, and go ahead and continue with the lifetime appointments, because we could do term limits, but that, you know, the people who argue against term limits and say, well, what about Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a great justice. Okay, so if these people are absolutely going to insist that we need to have lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court, then let's go all the way. Let's turn the Supreme Court into a House of Lords. Let's get them in 2020, when the Democrats are very likely to have the presidency and the presidency and the House and the Senate. Let's just take the Supreme Court. Let's just play hardball and change the nature of the Supreme Court to basically make it a House of Lords with lifetime appointments for people who have great merit. Ex-presidents could go in there who, you know, aren't unindicted rapists, which would, of course, exclude our current president, and go from there. The Supreme Court could still do all the things that it does now, and we could get rid of this fiction that they care about the law. Because the truth is that the conservatives don't care about the law. They just use any version of the law that they can to justify their arguments, but their arguments are political. Their arguments are illogical, and their arguments hold no water and no merit. They're totally inconsistent with each other, even within the oral arguments that they make. Why even maintain the illusion that they are legitimate? Because they just elected a rapist to the goddamn Supreme Court. Stop pretending that legitimacy depends on neutrality, because it does not.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Buy my friend's book, Shadow Path by William Maxwell, available on Amazon.com.
Copyright
For this podcast,
2018. Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC.
To fight the forces of evil!